Phoenix from the Ashes, The Making, Unmaking, and Restoration of Catholic Tradition by Henry Sire. The Papacy of Paul VI. Over the scene of devastation presides the remote figure of Paul VI. In two ways, the evaluation of the Pope's character has been colored by attitudes to the revolution in the Church with which we still live. Firstly, admirers of that change are precluded from the criticisms that a ruler would naturally incur in such circumstances. And secondly, the assumption that the changes were right and inevitable ones has obscured the extent to which Paul VI was personally responsible for them. Such points of view have prevented a realistic assessment of what, by any objective test, would be judged the most disastrous pontificate in history. In sustaining that estimate, we should first examine the personality of Paul VI. The son of a professional family of northern Italy, Giovanni Battista Montini chose an ecclesiastical career from his boyhood. At the age of 25, soon after his ordination, he became an official in the Secretary of State, and he continued in it until his appointment as Bishop of Milan 32 years later. Such a distinctively curial training has not been exceptional in a pope, but Montini's concurrent appointments as a chaplain to the Italian Union of University Students and professor to papal diplomats confirmed his links to intellectual rather than pastoral circles. Philosophically, Montini's mind was distinguished by a taste for French culture typical of liberal Italian circles. He was an admirer of Martinian, though as Pope he would take the Church in a direction the Martinians strongly repudiated. In 1950, he met the French philosopher Jean Guérin, who became his close lay friend and left an immediate portrait of him in his book, Paul VI's Secret. In church circles, Monsignor Montini's most decisive friendship was with Cardinal Roncalli, who on his election as Pope relied upon him as his close confidant. As we have seen, Montini has been appointed Archbishop of Milan by Pius XII, and his tenure of the office from 1954 to 1963 was marked, among other things, by a courageous determination to bring the Church to the urban working class. Perhaps more characteristic, however, were the Archbishop links with the progressive bourgeois world in which he was temperamentally more at home. That influence was to be seen later in the personnel he took with him to Rome, and was reflected in his own cultural style. In his Lenten Pastoral of 1962, Cardinal Montini outlined to the Maltese faithful that he saw as the new direction of Catholicism, pointed out by his friend John XXIII. The Church will divest itself, if need be, of whatever royal cloak still remains on its sovereign's shoulders, so that it may be put on the simpler forms modern taste demands. End quote. In harmony with his view, Paul VI, when he entered the Vatican, began to reform the Baroque splendors which had satisfied princes and peasants alike, and to redecorate the palace in a tasteful gray and pink color scheme favored in recent years by the gentile middle class of Milan. A change may symbolize the tone of his pontificate. Quote, "Thou hast conquered, refine the Maltese. The Church has grown gray with thy taste." End quote. On a more personal level, Paul brought with him a group of his close associates, chief of whom was Don Pasquale Macchi, his private secretary since 1954. Macchi was a leading figure in what became to be called the Milan Mafia, a phrase that turned out to be more appropriate than its inventors realized at the time. The secretary remained an influence of Paul VI well beyond his official position. In the mid-70s, as Monsignor Macchi, he was to be renamed as a member of the Great Vatican Lodge of Freemasons. His Masonic invitation during 1958 while he was secretary to Archbishop Montini. Beyond this personal circle, Pope Paul distinguishes himself by his favor to the ring of liberal cardinals, especially Cardinals Lercho, Suens, and Dupferner, who was considered illicitly before the conclave to bring about his election. Those who should by rights have been deprived of their cardinalate were employed in the most influential positions in the church. We have seen how the three cardinals mentioned were given a supervision of the council, that they were to push through the radical program. And we have also seen how the reform of the liturgy was handed over to Cardinal Lucio and Monsignor Bugnini to create a team of their own choosing. The latter provides a model of the self-expanding cliques to which Pope Paul's methods of rule granted control, and which in the field of the Church's finances led to the biggest Vatican scandal of the period. Determinant in Pope Paul's style of government was his view of the state of the Church. He shared the liberal confidence in the modern age as one of enlightenment and reason, as having overcome the crude passions of the past. In his Lenten Pastoral of 1962, Cardinal Montini had told the Maltese, quote, "Today, there are no errors in the Church, or scandals, or deviations, or abuses to correct." End quote. This pronouncement, to which the whole of the papacy constitutes a gloss, shows us the degree of acumen which he judged the contemporary scene. Even if Paul VI had not noticed for himself the dangers latent in the new theological trends, he might have alerted by the signs of the previous decade. When Pope Pius XII had closed the seminary in the Mission de France and deposed the 3 Dominican provincials in France, in his action against the incipient Marxism of the worker priest movement, we may link Pope Paul's insouciance on an impression Professor Gutian recommended. Quote, with him, one was not in the presence of a cleric, but of a layman, who seemed to have a suddenly elevated to the papacy. End quote. Aside from the optimism dictated by his liberal point of view, one might suggest that Pope Paul simply did not know enough about his job as a Catholic priest to elevate the church which he was called to govern. The assessment of Pope Paul's character was not easy even to himself. Quote, am I Hamlet or am I Don Quixote? End quote, he once asked. A doubt between indecision and unreality might be creative in a private thinker, but it was not the best qualification for a pope. His tentative style went with another trait that John Gutian noted. Quote, when he had taken a decision, it was quite impossible to get him to modify it in any way whatsoever. End quote. This firmness, is clear, reveals a man who cannot bear to have his judgment questioned once it has reached the stage of public scrutiny. Such details of a character go to explain why Giantavini Battista Montini, once raised to the papacy, provided an example of the imperfect subordinate who proves a failure when entrusted with supreme authority. Pope Paul's most significant weakness was his judgment of subordinates, displayed disastrously in the matter of the Vatican finances. Central to this was his appointment of Cardinal John Villot as Secretary of State. The connection of the two went back to the time when Villot, as Secretary of the French Episcopacy, corresponded with Monsignor Montini in Rome in the days of Pius XII. An aloof and secretive figure, Villot was a typical emarchy, promoting the mission of an enlightened elite to dispense progress to the multitude. When Cardinal Roncalli was elected pope, he had not thought that this jolly peasant was at all the right man to lead the church on the proper liberal paths. If the Pope had lived a year or two longer, he might have verified such fears. Villot's role in the Second Vatican Council, when he was conjurer of Archbishop of Lyons, was already been noted. Paul VI raised him to the cardinalate in 1965, brought him to the Curia 2 years later, and in May 1969 appointed him Secretary of State, replacing Cardinal Conchalli. Villot remained in office until his death in 1979. He benefited from a measure taken by Paul VI, in direct contrast to the professed aim of depoliticizing the church, whereby the Secretary of State was given general authority over all the departments of the Curia, thus introducing a secularization of the government of the church, under which it was labored ever since. Villot became the driving force in the campaign to stamp out traditional Catholicism, a policy that Pope Paul, left to himself, might have hesitated to take so far. His efforts to persuade the Pope to excommunicate Archbishop Lefebvre was, however, not successful. Cardinal Villot was named as one of the prominent Freemasons in the Vatican in the list that were to appear towards the end of Paul VI's reign. His date of admission to Freemasonry was given as 1966. As head of the administration of parliamenty of the Holy See, Villot was formally responsible for the thieves' kitchen into which the department was turned into in Paul VI's papacy. The initiative there belongs, however, to Monsignor Marchi. From the 1950s, he had his connections with leading figures in the Maltese financial world, including Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona. The latter was the most directly criminal of this circle. He was a Sicilian who moved to Milan after the war and made his fortune as an agent of the mafia's tax evasion, beginning from the late 50s to acquire a string of banks. At the same period, he gained the friendship of the city's archbishop, Cardinal Montini. In the 60s, Monsignor Marchi brought Sindona and Calvi into the world of Vatican finances. An associated figure was Umberto Artolani, like the latter two, a member of the Masonic Lodge, P2, whose status as the right man to Cardinal Lucio brought him close to the center of affairs under Paul VI. On the ecclesiastical side, the cast was completed by Archbishop Paul Marchius, a crude-mannered cleric from Chicago who enjoyed Paul VI's high favor from the beginning of his pontificate. Marcincus, also a crony of Monsignor Marchi, and in 1971 he was appointed president of Instituto per la Arte di Religione, popularly known as the Vatican Bank. That body was already being used by Sindona to transfer large sums of money from his Italian banks to Switzerland, an activity that he accompanied with currency speculation. In 1974, however, an American bank he had owned collapsed in what was called Il Crack Sindona, and the Holy See lost an estimated $30 million. The announcement to this affair only came after the death of Paul VI, when Sindona was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of the lawyer who was liquidating his banks and was himself murdered in prison by his mafia creditors. In the meantime, Archbishop Marchius had by 1972 come under investigation by the FBI in connection with the counterfeit bond fraud. But the case was not pursued. As with Sandina's misdeeds, the disclosures came after Paul VI's death. In 1981, Roberto Calvi was sentenced for currency offenses, but Archbishop Marchius continued to do business with him, citing the comment he had heard from somebody, quote, "If you're not caught, you're not worth anything," end quote. Nemesis came the following year, which Calvio Boncio Ambrosio collapsed with gigantic debts. The IOR had been the main shareholder, which Archbishop Marchius as a director, and had been used as a channel to move the Ambrosio's funds abroad. The drama was soon taken further by the mafia murder of Roberto Calvi, who was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. In 1989, the Vatican agreed to pay $224 million to Ambrosio's creditors in recognition of his responsibility to the collapse. Archbishop Marcincus, however, did not resign as president of the IOR, and he still refused to do so, being sheltered by the Vatican's sovereignty. When a warrant was issued for his arrest in 1987, Not until 1989 was when Pope Paul II, John Paul II, inspired to remove him from his position. The postscript in the story came in 1992 when Lucio Gelli, head of P2, and Umberto Ortolani, his deputy in the lodge, were sentenced to long terms imprisonment for fraud in connection with the bankruptcy of the Banco Ambrosio. These events have a bearing on the estimate of Paul VI as administrator of the Church. Those who find him blameless in the loss of millions of faithful may think the loss of many millions of dollars less commendable as a mark of wisdom. The criminal involvement began in his time was not the fault of an uncontrolled curia. It was the work of the men, Valet, Marci, and Marcanus, whom Paul VI himself brought into the Vatican, in whom he rested his special confidence. On the other side, the case throws light on the claims that the Council of Reform is recovering a fresher and untainted Christianity. The scandals in which it involved the Church's eclipse, the complaints which were made of the over-material interest of Paul XII's pontificate. The Church's financial manager of the time, Cardinal Canali, has been accused of relations with the papal banker, Count Enrico Gonzalez, who were less than spiritual. In the period, however, the Vatican had not taken to choosing its advisors from criminal fringes of Milan and Sicily, and one can hardly imagine Cardinal Canali associating with such characters. He would have thought it beneath his ecclesiastical dignity. In the 1960s, however, the voice of the new democracy urged the pastors of the Church to get their hands dirty, and that they certainly did. The closed circle of Vatican finance was drawn together by Masonic links of many of its members, and the web was one that during the Paul VI papacy spread into every part of the curia, notably in the departments of finance, of the Secretary of State, and the liturgy. The public disclosures were more than 100 names of clerics who were Freemasons began in 1976, and after Paul VI's death they were confirmed to Pope John Paul I by the journalist Minio Percoli, himself a disaffected member of the P2 Lodge. Percoli was an acknowledged expert in the secret ramifications of Italian society, and was to be murdered a few months later by those whom the revelations threatened. He made known to John Paul I existence of the Great Vatican Lodge. Those members he knew personally, including some of the most influential names in the Curia. The figures in the Masonic list include Cardinal Villot, Secretary of State from 1969 to 79, Archbishop Casaroli, the second man in the Secretary of the State from 67, and Villot's successor to the office, Monsignor Marci, Archbishop Marcanus, Cardinal Sinis of Michelin, the driving force behind much of the modernist campaign throughout Paul's reign, Archbishop Bugnini, the architect of the liturgical revolution, Cardinal Poldetti, president of the Liturgical Academy and member for the Congregation for Divine Worship, and Cardinal Baggio, who as president of the Congregation of Bishops indicated the proceedings to suspend Archbishop Lefebvre A. Divinis in 1976. When these and many other names were made public, the response of some was to call it the list a Lefebvrist invention. That expression can be discounted. Apart from the individuals mentioned, there was very little correlation between the list and the enemies of traditionalism. Moreover, the information given is merely a list of names, code names, and dates of emission. It did nothing to promote the Lefebvrist belief in the infiltration of Masonic agents into the clergy, trying to rise to the top and subvert the Church. All the dates of initiation given to the list are from the previous 20 years or so, when the clerics in question are already well established in the Church, and one may suppose that the majority have joined the society from motives of self-advancement. In fact, the disclosures seem to represent a leak of the confidential list of members that under Italian law, secret societies are obliged to deposit with the government. Most of the ecclesiastics mentioned had probably not become Freemasons for ideological reasons, let alone as part of a conspiracy. Nevertheless, their membership displays a contempt for the law of the Church, which at the time decreed excommunication ipso facto for adherence to the Freemasonry. And in some cases, such as Cardinal Violet's, it reflects an attachment to the Masonic ethos of liberal humanism, mediated by a favored circle of political directors to the backward populace. It is said that one of the unrealized intentions of Pope John Paul I in his 33-day pontificate, August and September of 1978, was to clear some or all of the men named as Freemasons out of the Curia. Like most details of the affair, this will only be verified when the Church someday decides to reveal the inner facts of the vast subversion in the reign of Paul VI. It is known, however, that John Paul's proposed changes dismayed Cardinal Violet, who described them as a betrayal of Pope Paul's will, a triumph for restoration. That restoration never took place, for John Paul II chose to ignore the information and to keep the government of the Church under the men who were advanced by Paul VI. Against these strands of Paul VI's pontificate, we can set the conventional estimates given by biographies and other works. The premise of these is to ignore the obvious facts of the reign. The secession of tens of thousands of priests from the ministry, eased by Paul VI's policy of granting laicization automatically to those who asked for it. The loss of countless thousands of religious vocations, the tumultuous desertion by the laity of the Mass, renovated for their benefit, the collapse of the Papacy's authority, and to present the period as a catalogue of reform. Edmund Duffy in Saints and Sinners finds it possible to describe Paul VI's pontificate as the greatest of the 20th century. Judgments of this sort put one in the mind of praises of the statesmanship of Marshal Pétain in the heyday of the Nazi regime, a genre in writing which the acknowledgement of reality is replaced by deference to the ruling ideology. Paul VI was certainly responsible, partly by inaction, for the revolution in the Church that was seen in his 15 years. But which of that revolution took place from no initiative of his and against his will? If we look at his rule, we find some policies which are certainly due to him. The first of these was the handing of the council and the control of the modernist wing. This isn't the decision from which the whole current of his pontificate followed. Yet even here, Pope Paul's influence was only procedural. There was no doctrinal direction such as a great teaching the Pope might have given, nor even the following of a structured plan for a council that Montini had outlined in 1962. The second policy was the liturgical revolution, which Paul VI pushed forward personally from beginning to end. Here again, however, his part consisted merely in putting the liturgical consulum under Cardinal Lucio and Monsignor Bugnini and letting them do with it how they pleased. Pope Paul VI had no competence in the liturgy himself. In October 1965, as we have seen, he had no notion that the reform was being directed to the composition of a new liturgy, and the only personal contribution of his we find in the process was to excise some of the more radical details of the Novus Ordo. Aside from that, we can certainly ascribe it to Paul VI that the Curia was transformed from the Italian trade union it had once been into an international body chosen from the whole Church. In other circumstances, that would have been commendable, but in practice it was of limited use to reform government while undermining its effective powers. The keeping of Cardinal Ottaviani as secretary of the Holy Office, renamed in 1965 as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, reflected Pope Paul's conviction that both the dicastery and its head were obsolete relics. The policy of placing well-informed theologians at the head of the congregation to give the Holy See an effective hand on the pulse of modern theology did not even enter into Pope Paul's thinking. The redundancy of that department, was one example of curial impotence introduced by his rule. While the rise in number of Vatican officials during his reign from 1,322 to 3,150 recalls the well-known analysis of growth and bureaucracy as the mark of a declining institution. On the other hand, it is to the credit of Pope Paul that we began the program of worldwide papal travel with which we are now familiar with today. A policy from which Pius XII had thought himself debarred, and for which John the 23rd had been too old. Without that personal contact of the Pope with the world, the campaign of populist recovery that John Paul II carried out on his pontificate would hardly have been possible. Another change that certainly expressed Paul VI's will was the creation of bodies designed to promote collegial government of the Church. The most important of these was the Synod of Bishops, which began to meet in Rome from 1967 onward. Yet, one has to say that the character of that body as an organ of episcopal control is one of the myths of consular reform. This was illustrated especially in the Synod's first meeting, when its opposition to Bugnini's new Mass was blatantly overridden. The new liturgy was imposed almost unchanged in form from the Synod that had rejected, and the procedures to introduce it took care to avoid any further consolation of the bishops. Nor can one see Paul VI as an inspirer, for better or for worse, of the doctrinal movements that marked his reign. For their leading features, such as the revolutionized model of the priesthood and the acceptance of liberal Protestant biblical criticism, owed nothing to any of the teachings of Paul VI, though he took no action to prevent or even regulate them. After the publication of Humanae Vitae in 1968, Pope Paul was so unnerved by his Velplitude reception that he dared not to publish another encyclical for the rest of his reign. Even the statement of the Church's social teaching, which was traditionally published on every 10th anniversary of Reverum Novarum, took the form in 1971 not of an encyclical, but of a public letter to the Cardinal Roy. The paralysis of the papacy's teaching authority in Paul VI's reign has thus given constitutional expression. We can assess the implication of these facts by reflecting that if the modernist view of the Church were true, it would be possible for radical change to be made by a strong reforming pope, an ecclesiastical Gladstone or Franklin Roosevelt. There is no such figure in which we find in Paul VI. What we see in his reign is not enlightened direction, but anarchy spreading under the pressure of modernist leaders and public, in fact journalistic, opinion, accepted by Pope Paul with every sign of hesitancy and reluctance. His feelings were expressed in well-known pronouncements, such as in December 1968 when he bewalled the self-destruction of the Church, or in June 1972 when he spoke in a sermon of the adverse power of the devil, whom the gospel calls the mysterious enemy of man, something preternatural which came to suffocate the fruits of the Vatican Council. This less than hearty valuation of the movements of his time also fails to suggest a high sense of his own skill in guiding them. In fact, if we ask why Paul VI is approved by those who believe in the Consular Revolution, it is mainly because he did nothing to check it. One cannot help seeing what an unpopular Pope Paul would have been if he had been a conservative, governing the Church along conventional lines. His ineffectiveness, his remoteness from popular feeling, and his lack of doctrinal knowledge would have been easily recognized as fundamental defects. But it was only under a pope of that character that the revolution could have been put through. And what it teaches us is the highest ideal of a pope available to the liberals is not one who is strong, but one who fails to rule the Church. Leaving aside the question of doctrine, few popes in history have shown such an array of disqualifications for their office as Paul VI did. The exclusive dependence on the point of view of Western European intellectuals, the one-sidedness in promoting the influence of a single party, the reliance on a small circle of confidence, this misjudgment in the choice of subordinates, the amateurishness in doctrine and legislation, the weakness and indecision and wherewithal, the absoluteness in enforcing a partisan policy. All these mark Paul VI pointedly from his predecessors. One would surely have to go back to one of the obscure popes of the 18th century, or even earlier, to find a distant parallel. But Paul VI was not granted obscurity. It fell upon him to govern the church at a time when a council had been called, and when the need to preserve the Christian vision against the pressures of the contemporary world was especially urgent. One asks then how Paul VI had been spared the evaluation due to him, how he can be seen as a promoter of collegial government when his most distinctive policy, the new liturgy, was imposed in contempt of any collegial process. How commentators can ignore the salient fact of his time was the collapse of papal authority, that his pontificate was a trail of scandalous appointments and an unheard of loss. He escapes condemnation by biographers because everything that he did or failed to do tended to the submission of the church to the world. Since the world was looking for a church without authority, a pope without authority seemed the most appropriate model. With every error of Paul VI's secular opinion, instead of marking it against him, saw with satisfaction the victory of modern standards, the weakening of the church. Far from judging his failures, observers would have blamed him if they had followed a different course, if he had favored the middle ground of the council instead of the European radicals, if he had listened to the bishops instead of the liturgical vandals, if he had given away less, if he had inflicted less damage upon the church's heritage. In the short term, therefore, Paul VI escapes a realistic estimate, but the idols of the present age will not last forever, either in the world or in the church. When they have passed, he will be judged in the light of the anarchy which he promoted within the church, the relaxation of its own division of mind. Even as he imposed the acceptance of the Novus Ordo, he was wrapped in remorseful phrases. It is no longer in Latin, we find him saying, but the common tongue that will be the principal language of the Mass. For whoever knows the beauty and the power of Latin, its aptitude in expressing sacred things, this will certainly be a great sacrifice, to see it replaced by the common tongue. We are losing the language of Christian centuries. We are becoming like intruders and outsiders in the literary domain of sacred expression. We are thus losing, to a great extent, the admirable and incomparable artistic and spiritual richness that is the Gregorian chant. We have reason, to be sure, to feel regrets and almost a confusion over this." End quote. Confusion indeed is the mark of a man who knew the treasure of which his policy was depriving the faithful, but who pursued it nonetheless. Pursued it, moreover, with blind intolerance, in proscribing the liturgical tradition of the Church. Pursued it while invoking the pastoral needs of a laity who were deserting this new worship in their millions. Paul VI's psychological peculiarities, held in the glare of modern scrutiny, perhaps throw light on the failures of earlier popes whose characters are lost in the darkness of our times. We know nothing of the weakness of Honorius, whose submission to the Eastern Emperor earned him 50 years later the stern condemnation of Pope Leo. We anathematize Honorius, who did not seek to purify the apostolic church with the teaching of apostolic tradition, but by a profane betrayal permitted its stainless faith to be surrendered. End quote. It may be, however, that the Church's censure will one day be passed on Paul VI, as on Honorius, as one who did not, as become the apostolic authority, quench the flame of heretical doctrine as it sprang up, but quickened it in its negligence." End quote.